Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Conversations in Time podcast. So, over to the guys.
Hello, and welcome to another Conversations in Time podcast. I'm John N.
And I'm Ian G.
So, we've had a little bit of a break, holidays and stuff, so hopefully we're going to start producing more of these. Excellent podcasts. Well, that's what I call them anyway. Don't know about anybody else. We haven't seen anybody saying they're not excellent, So, anyway. Ian, where are we going to go today?
So we're going to delve into a little specific bit of alternative history.
So it is an alternative history podcast, after it.
Let me finish. In a little bit more...
Trying to banter us up a bit.
Oh, okay. Fair enough. It's bantery.
Banter facts.
The favourite expression of many an HR department. Anyway,
get the buzz.
Buzz is one thing. Banter's usually the prelude to disciplinary action, isn't it? But anyway, it was only a bit of banter, honest. But anyway, we're going to talk about a bit of aviation geekness, for want of a better expression, that some of you will have heard of. Probably most of you haven't. But we're going to talk about the British aircraft from the 1950s, or certainly the concept of 50s, but most of the 1960s, called the TSR2, which was a big political brouhaha of the time in terms of it. It's no hot spoiler here. It was cancelled. So we'll talk about what it was, and then what might have happened had it not been cancelled.
So, out of interest, what does TSR stand for then?
So it's a designation for its role. So T for tactical, S for strike, R for reconnaissance. So it was a multi-role aircraft. It's like a lot of these acronyms that came along after the Second World War. Aren't all aircraft multi-role by and large? Admittedly, they don't all perform the same range of activities, but they generally do more than one. Strike and reconnaissance. Any aircraft that can carry a bomb can carry a camera by and large. But anyway, so funny though, although I can't actually think what the TSR-1 was, if truth be told.
I was going to say, because that was going to be my next question. What was the TSR-1?
I don't know, but 9 times out of 10, it's generally just it's the same aircraft, except there's it's moved the development the requirements of the role have changed whilst the aircraft was in development. So we'll have to Google it specifically, but say 9 times out of 10 just means that here's the requirement for the aircraft, and whilst they're designing it, somebody tacked something else on the end that was sufficiently different for a number to be changed to designate it as a different type of aircraft. And the first aircraft may not have existed. So that's what we're going to talk about then. So, let's do a very brief synopsis. All this is in Wikipedia. If anybody wants to get the nitty gritty,
Wikipedia.
Yeah, it's there. But let's give a 5-10 minute synopsis of what happened, and then we can talk about what could have happened. So really, it was an aircraft requirement of the late 1950s when the existing RAF aircraft of the time were deemed to be vulnerable to being shot down ultimately. So that we were talking about the primarily the Canberra aircraft, which was a twin engine jet aircraft, first flew in the late 1940s. One of Britain's most successful aircraft, built under license by the Americans, became the B-57, but bought in its British version, built in Britain and under license by many.
So it was an actual plane that the Americans bought off Britain.
Yeah, as well as the Harrier.
The Canberra. Yeah,
the Canberra and the Harrier in that sense.
That's a pretty rare event, really.
It was, but although it was built under license and amended here and there, and flew to a large degree in the Vietnam War, the Canberra, or its RB4 in its B-57 designation. So
that's what the Americans called it.
They did, yes.
It's all news to me. Sorry.
Well, okay.
Now I'm interrupted.
Yeah, that's right. So the TSR2 was to replace the Canberra, and to a certain extent the Hawker Hunter, which was a ground attack aircraft. Less the case, but certainly in that area. the reason the Canberra needed replacing, because the Canberra was a high altitude aircraft. It flew extremely high. When it first flew, nothing could fly as high as it, because it couldn't be intercepted by anything likely to be deemed an enemy. Primarily the Soviet Union, but obviously other countries that around the world, and that's why it was a successful export. It was bought by many air forces. That was done away with by the development of surface-to-air missiles. So surface-to-air missiles were able to reach those altitudes by the late 1950s, and in the 1960s, for example, the U-2, Gary Powers' U-2 American spy aircraft shot down illustrates that flying high worked for maybe 10, 15 years, but then obviously that wasn't deemed to be safe. The TSR2 the requirement for was to fly at low level underneath radar. How low is open to debate, but certainly below 1,000 feet, and it obviously depends on the terrain. So if you're flying through valleys and stuff, you get screened from the radar by hills. If you're flying over desert, you have to fly even lower. So it was capable of flying at required to fly extremely low level, using its own radar to develop, to actually fly the aircraft itself. So the pilot would be hands off, and the aircraft would fly itself at extreme low level and very fast. So it's certainly above the speed of sound.
So it was so the requirement was supersonic then as well.
Yes.
So the Canberra wasn't a supersonic.
No, this Canberra wasn't. No.
So it was supersonic. So I mean, the low flying capability. I mean, I'm assuming that they didn't say it had to be hands off. That just happened to be how they implemented it.
I can't remember, but I suspect it was hands off, because for example, the Vulcan bomber, which many people might be familiar with, a delta shaped aircraft. Again, Google it if you're not familiar. Quite a unique looking aircraft. It had terrain following radar, but the pilot was required to follow the input on the screen and fly the aircraft based on the input. So it had terrain following radar as much as it had the radar that was capable of identifying terrain. It then fed this back to the pilot, who flew manually. The TSR.
Did the Vulcan come after the TSR2?
Well, the Vulcan came before it, and strictly speaking, on a slightly different role. So the Vulcan was a strategic aircraft, a strategic bomber, as much as it was carrying a nuclear weapon to Moscow, inverted commas. The TSR2 was both nuclear and conventional. Its role was what's known as interdiction. So, i.e., as per the words, you interrupt, you interdict the enemy's communications behind the enemy lines. So you're going after very much what drones do now in the Ukraine-Russia war. You're going after strategic assets like command and control, logistics, supplies, oil refineries, concentration of military build-up, that sort of thing, behind the enemy lines, carrying a nuclear weapon and conventional weapons. Whereas the Vulcan wasn't doing that. It was going after. It was a nuclear deterrent. It was destroying cities and such like. Not a pleasant thought, but that's what it was doing. So it was after the Vulcan. But the point being is, the Vulcan had terrain following radar, but it was manually flown, whereas the TSR2 would be, because of the speed.
So with this radar then, how innovative was that? Was that something that Britain innovated with?
Not really. I mean, it wasn't. I mean, obviously there were a handful of countries that and still are. There were only a handful of countries that were capable of producing aircraft of this type: America, France, Britain, Soviet Union, and yes, other countries had technology that fed into these programs or could have fed into the programs, but no, putting the entire package together, it wasn't a secret. How it actually worked was the secret, if you see what I mean. Making it work was the secret. So its role was, as I said, was to replace the Canberra and to certainly set in the Hawker Hunter in a interdiction role. It wasn't a battlefield. It wasn't a battlefield aircraft. It wasn't doing close air support for troops in contact with the enemy. It was going after not strategic targets, but tactical targets.
Yeah, but like you say, it was multifunction, and in theory, you would have had one of those instead of three other types of plane, which would have had specialities, wasn't it?
No, yes and no. I mean, the thing about multi-purpose aircraft is that with the later Tornado, which was flown in European Air Forces, was that the multi-purpose aspect of it is really around the airframe. So you build an airframe, and it's a strike aircraft, and you build an aircraft, and it's a reconnaissance. It wasn't until the 5th generation aircraft came along, like the Typhoon and the F-35 and the F-18, where that was what they call a swing role. So you take off as a fighter, and you can also be a bomber. The multi-role basically means that you have a squadron that does one thing using the same plane, but the squadrons, they aren't interchangeable, because although the aircraft is 95% the same, it's the 5% bit where you carry the bombs or carry the camera or carrying specialist radar. But that's built in. You can't swap it out.
Yeah. But is it fair to say that multi-role was something that was new into?
Yes and no. I mean, as I say,
there wasn't a multi-role in the Second World War, and let's face it, when it's talking.
No, there was. The Mosquito was the classic multi-role because it was a fighter bomber. So it's like everything after
It's an evolution then of that.
Yeah, but as much as anything else, it's and I'm trying to think of the term, but it wasn't just in aircraft. It's the pseudo-scientific terminology of the 1950s and 60s. You can sell more aircraft if you persuade somebody it's a multi-role aircraft.
Yeah.
I'm loath to use the word BS, but we worked in an industry that was full of BS terminology, and it's really just terminology that tries to persuade somebody that you're getting more bang for your buck. But are you really? Yeah, well, you are, in the sense that if you have the same airframe with the same engines across the fleet, you save money by only having to teach people how to repair that airframe in that.
Yeah, well, there's logic to it.
Yeah, but you can't take if you build, for example, the TSR2, that there was tactical reconnaissance and strike. The reconnaissance version could be converted to a bomber, but you couldn't just jump into it, set some bombs on it, and fly off and think,
it wasn't a 5-minute change.
No, it wasn't. Yeah, absolutely. And there's lots of examples of that with other aircraft. But the equivalent of it, if you like, during the Second World War was Mosquito, which was both a fighter and a bomber. And to a certain extent, most aircraft, with the exception of very few strategic aircraft, which most countries didn't have, were fighter bombers. But there's an element of how much it was a fighter and how much it was a bomber. The TSR2 had it was never a fighter. It was never an interceptor, and it had no weaponry other than the weapons it carries, i.e. bombs.
I mean, in terms of how far they got it developed, yeah.
Well, no, it had no offensive weapons other than the bombs. It didn't have it didn't have the agility to be a fighter. It didn't have the radar to be a fighter. It didn't have the range. Well, depending on what you want to be a fighter for. It certainly had the range, but depending on what you want to do with it. But it was developed as a interdicting aircraft. So a number of
quick aside. Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you. Just to for our listeners that we do talk about the Mosquito in a previous episode, and just how good that plane was, So anyway,
and hence because it was adaptable,
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
The same airframe was used for a variety of different things. You take out the gums. You take out the guns. You can put in more bombs. You take out some bombs, and you can put in machine guns. You take out both the bombs and the machine guns and cannon. You can go a hell of a long way because you can put extra tanks in, the fuel tanks.
Anyway, back to TSR.
So the TSR2, a number of prototypes were made. During the test, so I think 6. During the, again, Google.
4, isn't it?
I don't know, Google it.
I watched the video earlier, and you said 4.
Well, okay, I'm pretty certain it was 6, but whatever. We can argue over Wikipedia, over social media with the listeners later on. But the flight testing identified a number of issues, as that's the whole point of it. But some of the specification requirements it struggled to make. So it was deemed to be slower than the specification, although it was still adequately fast. I mean,
twice the speed of sound. Yeah.
Yeah. Its range would have been restricted because more equipment it became heavier. Well, again, that's always the case. And during the flight testing, it's undercarriage, i.e. the wheels. If you Google some pictures of a highly complicated process of lowering and raising the wheels, lots of different bits of hydraulics and stuff in the first place. But during flight testing, when it came into land, the landing gear was very wobbly. interacted with parts of the airflow in unexpected ways. So it had to be redesigned and became even more complicated.
But there
So
was
all
a
that-
reason for that, though. I mean, I'm only going up, which was, if, and you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, because I've only watched, I've only researched this today, was that one of the requirements was it had to take off from a short runway that could be pretty scruffy, which was why the landing, the landing gear or the wheels were as big and as awkward
Yeah.
as they looked, was to enable that.
Yeah, which was one of the other things that the length of runway it required essentially was deemed to have doubled. It was still well within normal.
It's still shorter than probably equivalent.
Yeah,
It's
well,
still
certainly heavy.
shorter.
It was a relatively heavy aircraft, so certainly. But yeah, but again, so on the face of it, the customer, i.e., the government, stroke the British taxpayer, was looking at its requirements, and this aircraft was short of all of them. But that was true of any development aircraft. But if you're a homeowner and you say I want 6 windows and they turn up to 5 and they're all the wrong different size, it gives you an excuse. But anyway, so that was that. The cost was overrunning, and in the left, I'll try and get to the end of the development. In the left side of the play, shall we say, exit stage left was the American F-111, which which ultimately became quite a successful aircraft, but had a very tortured development cycle itself. But they didn't know that at the time. It looked like a off-the-shelf aircraft. It had all the requirements that the TSR2 had, albeit it was struggling against them as well. But it was deemed to be cheaper. Would have a longer shelf life. I mean, ultimately, it flew on into the 1990s with the Americans, and the Australians flew it well into the late 90s. And between that and inter-service rivalry, so the classic inter-service rivalry between in any country between the RAF and the Royal Navy, the Navy had this concept of aircraft carriers, or they had their own problems with that. Ultimately, their aircraft carriers were chopped, or their fast jet aircraft carriers were chopped as well. But at the time, they weren't. So there was lots of rivalry saying we want the money for our aircraft carriers and our new aircraft. No, they didn't get it in the end, but they made enough of a brouhaha to put the whole sort of cost around TSR2 up. So because of the
Well, there were other reasons as well.
go on then, what were some of the other reasons?
So just to come back to the F-111,
I
mean, Britain never bought that, did they? Because
Correct, but it was buying.
the Australians essentially said, "Look, this is a very expensive."
In the context of TSR2, Britain was buying it. We only cancelled the order in 1968, and TSR2 was cancelled long before then. So
No, I know it was, but they were looking at it as an alternative,
yes,
as a cheaper alternative,
Yeah.
and they didn't buy it because the Australians basically said it's not a cheaper alternative.
that wasn't known at the time, though. That was you could only have known that.
Yeah, well, the Australians knew because they bought it earlier than.
Yeah,
Well,
Australia said that's what I said about the development issues. There were development issues with the F-111, but that wasn't apparent when the TSR2 was cancelled.
No, I know it wasn't. There was a
So-
different reason for why the TSR2 was cancelled, as I understand it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. So, and I'm going on what I watched on YouTube. So,
So it must be true. Go on.
so was that in 64 or was it 65? There was the general election when the Labour Party got in, and they wanted to concentrate on social issues, spend more money. So one of the things they cut was a lot of military budgets, and one of them, the very first one, was the TSR2, because the original budget of 35 million had gone up to 125
Yeah,
million.
it'd gone way
And it
over
was still going to go up
way over
end.
budget.
That's right. So they cancelled it, and then there was the view that they were going to buy the F-111 because it was seen as meeting the requirement for less money. But at some point, somebody in Australia contacted the UK and said,
No, I don't know that. I mean, I'm with you on the first 2 points because essentially that's what I said. But somebody in Australia contacting the UK government in 1964 is I don't know what YouTube video.
No, in 64, nothing to do with the TSR2. This was just when the British government decided, well, they still needed a plane that was multi-role, and it wasn't going to be the TSR2 because they'd already cut it, and they'd made the decision to go F-111.
Right. So,
but then they cancelled it, and then cancelled it for a reason. And that's why it was the Australian government saying, "Oh, this is costing a lot more than we expected."
well, I agree, but we're talking about the TSR2, not the F-111. But
No, I know we are, but I'm just trying to get the context right and the background, for what you said. It just the way you said it was if Britain had bought F-111s and they didn't buy F-111s. That was the point I was trying to make at the time.
Well, everybody didn't buy F-111s because there weren't any flying.
Not everybody who's listening to this podcast might not know.
Well, they know now then. So yeah, so the F-111 was cancelled in 1968, which was 4 or 5 years after TSR2. But you're right, the Australian Air Force bought the F-111 eventually, but it was a long, complicated and painful development cycle. It was pretty painful for the American Air Force as well. They flew it in Vietnam and it had a very bad survival rate, and they really couldn't figure out why. And what essentially was it wasn't even being shot down. Essentially, it was being manoeuvred at high speed over North Vietnam, and its tail was falling off. And which is a bit of a shocking state of affairs for our operational aircraft. Not every plane, not every flight, obviously, but something was going wrong, and they assumed it was being shot down. So that added. This was when the Australians decided that they, or discovered that they weren't going to get them when they thought they were going to get them. So yeah, and it became much more expensive.
Yeah, and I mean Britain ultimately went with the Jaguar and something else, wasn't it?
So yeah, we're going off a wee bit topic here. So eventually, Britain went with the Phantom,
for Navy.
No, for the RAF as well. For Strike, and the Buccaneer for Strike.
The Buccaneer was the other one. Yeah,
but the Buccaneer did come from the Navy, but the Navy was flying it for a period alongside the RAF, and then when the Buccaneer and Phantoms were retired in inverted commas from the Navy, they were passed over to the RAF. And then, as you say, the Jaguar attack aircraft replaced the Phantom in the attack role, and the Phantom replaced the Lightning in the air defense role. Yeah, interceptor role. So so that's the background. You're right. I mean, ultimately, it was a decision that was too expensive. There were other priorities. It wasn't. Would it have been successful? It had lots of little issues.
Well, if you look at so I'm only going on what I've seen. Where you see these documentaries from the 80s, what it looks like, and on the sort of final test flights, because I mean, ultimately, it only had 30 flights or something. They only flew it 30 times or something like that.
Yeah.
And they were tweaking it every time, and it was still a way off production.
Yeah.
But the test pilots were at the end were starting to say this is really hitting the mark, or is starting to get to where it needs to be. Super fast, very smooth.
Yeah.
And all this sort of stuff. So I mean, this is where we carry on with the counterfactual, as if, all right, well, I mean, we could talk about why it costs so much money, and I don't know whether the fact that your opinion of the way that the contract was awarded, where they created that BAC out of Vickers and
an amalgamation. Yeah, so there was an amalgamation.
Whether that was a problem, whether that caused more more spend, I don't know.
Well, ultimately, the reason it cost much money, and it wasn't, for goodness sake, it was hardly the only thing, and it happens today. I mean, it doesn't happen quite as scandalously today. Is essentially what they did in those days. They went to an aircraft manufacturer and said, "How much would it cost you to make this plane?" And they would say £10 million. And then they would go to them, down the club in Westminster, and say, okay, so it costs you, how much profit do you need to make? So the manufacturer would say, it will cost us £10 million to make this, plus X% for our profit. That's what it's going to cost you. So it does. So and I'm not suggesting it was corrupt, but it was hardly a taxpayer friendly process. And then what happened usually is the original, and I'm obviously making these figures up, the original £10 million became £15 million plus profit, and then it became £18 million plus profit, and then becomes £25 million plus profit. And you think, are we ever going to get this aircraft? And it becomes 30 million. And, and again, this happens today.
No, that's right. So, I mean, of the thing that I saw, one of the key factors for the price overrun was that when they did the original estimates, people didn't realise how much turning a plane or a design, which was basically subsonic, into supersonic, because there weren't any supersonic fighters there weren't any supersonic aircraft that had been.
Well, there weren't any strike aircraft.
So they didn't understand the amount of money it would cost to actually make it supersonic.
Yeah, but my point is that the entire process, there was no. I mean, the American equivalent. Now, again, how much corruption went on, no more than any other country, but the American equivalent always, almost without exception, has a fly-off. Is they have Boeing building plane A, Lockheed building plane B, General Dynamics building plane C, And that's happened. That happens today in America. Now, European
Yeah, but
countries
those guys,
can't afford that.
That's
Well,
right.
exactly. They can't afford the risk.
to do it.
Yeah,
That's right.
yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. But it's not only that; is that the companies they have over time, but the companies don't go bust if they lose the order because they're building something else. They're busy.
Right, but in Britain, post-war, now and there's one contract on the table.
Well, there was until as you say, until the aircraft themselves became so complicated that they well into the 1950s. There was a variety of different manufacturers building the building prototypes against a requirement, and the prototype would be chosen. But that as the aircraft, as you say, became more complicated and more expensive, the companies either didn't bid because they couldn't risk losing, or they didn't have the technological knowledge or staff to bid. So it kind of then one company, and as these companies merged together, it became one company, and then the process did become. There's a term for it. I can't remember what it's called, but where you basically agree whatever it costs, we'll pay it, and the cost just keeps going up and up, and you have to. Yeah. But in America,
they amalgamate it. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah. As we said, in America, they have a fly-off. They've had one just recently where the so-called F-47 two bid for it, and Boeing won. What a surprise to a certain extent, but
it'll be SpaceX next. I don't worry. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure that Nutter's
F-48
into planes yet, but once he's finished destroying the government, no doubt he'll
where there's money, there's interest.
Yeah.
Let's stop for a word from our sponsors.
Is your head in the cloud, but you really want your feet on the ground? Tired of big tech storing your data on fancy, state-of-the-art servers? Want a greener, earthier alternative? Introducing from No, soiled storage. Yes, a world's first storage option made from 100% recycled servers. That's right, we take unwanted, discarded servers, give them a light dust off, and boom, instant, eco-friendly storage. They may be soiled, they may be slower, but they're almost as good as new. So what's the USP? Being soiled means spending pennies, not those crazy big bucks for hosting it sky high.
Soiled storage saved my business. Sure, my downloads are a tad slow. We've all got plenty of spare time, right? It's totally worth it.
Sign up today and get a whopping 1 megabyte free. Go on, get soiled today. You won't look back. Blimey, No has only gone and done it again.
Today's episode is sponsored by Techno, helping yesterday, today. Techno is a subsidiary of Uncle Schnookums Enterprises, wholly owned and operated by Deforest Co. Global, pioneers in transforming the world's rainforests into your favorite products. All rights reserved. No claims or returns will be honored.
And we're back.
So let's look at the counterfactuals. I mean, as far as the counterfactual, ultimately, this is because I have had conversations with, stroke arguments with people that's online. When people talk about great British sort of defence things that were cancelled, and I'm not talking about the last 10 years, obviously, but if you look at the 1960s, there was a variety of things, not just the TSR2, there was a super aircraft carrier, and there was a variety of innovative things that were cancelled. We're still here. We're still British. We're still a democracy. We've not been invaded. British soldiers and sailors and airmen haven't been massacred here, there, and everywhere. Yes, you can look at the Falklands War and some of the naval aspects of that, but the TSR would have no impact on that. So you could argue, well, the government made the right decision because we survived. The ultimate aim of any aircraft or aircraft carrier or tank is to defend A, the country, then B, its forces when deployed. And I cannot think of anything since 1964 where a TSR2, and I'll come back and we'll look at, I'm just talking at the strategic view, where the TSR2 did something or would have done something that a Phantom, a Harrier, a Typhoon, a Tornado, or whatever, obviously they were later on, but they, failed to do, or a Vulcan at the time, so.
No, for me, yeah. I mean, what I think could have happened, and obviously it's only could, was that they would have sold a lot, regardless of what it did. But I mean, it was advanced. It was potentially ahead of its time. It would have been a star performer, and they could have sold many of these across the world.
Well, yes and no. Because I kind of guessed you were going to say that because there's a massive grain of truth in it. I think I agree with you on the technology, but I don't agree with you about the aircraft. And what I mean by that is because the aircraft was designed for a specific purpose. There wasn't really many countries.
Well, 3 specific purposes. Yeah.
Well, yeah, okay, but its primary unique selling point was his ability to penetrate deep into the Soviet Union, or certainly the western half of the Soviet Union, East Germany and Poland and Belarus. There weren't many countries that had an equivalent requirement. No, the Americans would never buy it for all the obvious. They never buy anything British. So
we should say that, but they bought the camera. I mean,
they bought the license. They didn't buy it. They didn't make any jobs in the UK. Just made somebody somewhere richer because they bought the license.
They wouldn't have bought it. You're right.
Yeah, the Australians could have bought it because they bought the F-111. So, but because they obviously bought the Canberra, and they bought they bought many British, even to some extent do now, but because of ties to the old country and all that sort of stuff. So, so you think, well, who's the customer for this incredibly, what would have been by the time, incredibly expensive, and at the time, the Saudis and what have you, they were just starting to buy expensive stuff, but the Americans would have probably vetoed selling stuff to the Saudis in that era, less so later on.
These are the European countries that they could have sold some to.
Possibly, but the French wouldn't buy them for the same reasons Americans wouldn't buy them, and the other NATO country. But I'm coming to your side in a minute. The other NATO countries were very much focused, as they are today, on tactical aircraft. So the fighter bombers that are fighters and can drop bombs on troops rather than troop concentrations, if you see what I mean. And certainly none of them had a tactical nuclear requirement, but the technology, had it proven to work, the train following rate, the automatic train following radar, the avionics because one of the things we didn't talk about, its speciality was navigation. Flying at low level at high speed from A to B to C to D is extremely. This is pre-GPS, obviously, is extremely difficult because essentially, how do I know where I am? So it had a very sophisticated navigation system. All that technology could have been sold as a separate package. I don't mean it would arrive as a box in some airfield, but in terms of developing onto other aircraft, and arguably it did, and arguably it went into not arguably, most of that technology it was upgraded. Most of that technology went into ultimately what became the Tornado, and the Tornado was bought by Germany and Italy, Saudi Arabia. It was in large numbers. It was a successful aircraft, and it was developed in the early 1970s, which was only 10 years after TSR2. So a lot of the technology that was in TSR2, it was changed in the sense of what was analog valve-driven technology went into early multiprocessors and in the computing, but essentially it was the same. It was the same logic. Just the hardware was updated. Went into a Tornado, became a relatively successful aircraft in terms of selling it abroad.
Yeah. So with the Tornado, I'm only going on what I saw on this video, and somebody was going on about the fact that the TSR2 was faster than a Tornado, had a longer range than a Tornado, could carry more weapons than a Tornado, but I don't know whether the Tornado is the same plane or has the same function or not.
Well, this is why, but that's why the Tornado was a more successful aircraft because the reason that everything's a payoff. If I'm carrying more, if I'm going further, faster, I'm bigger and carrying more fuel, and I've got and not the
But it was only bigger in terms of, like the wings were pretty small. I mean, they were quite.
Yeah, I'm talking about wing area rather than size, but I'm talking about weight.
Yeah.
So, and the number of buyers of that type of aircraft, it's half a dozen, if that. And as I said, you're not going to sell it to China, and the Russians have got their own. Oh, you wouldn't sell it to them anyway. The Americans won't buy it. The French won't buy it. The Australians might. Whereas, the Tornado wasn't bought by huge countries, but it was bought by enough. So, and the Tornado itself was was a heavy aircraft.
No, but the thing with what I'm trying to get to is the Tornado was Anglo, Italian,
German,
whereas the TSR2 would have been all UK.
Yeah,
so economically it could have been slightly different. That's all.
Well, but as I said, I don't think anybody would have bought it. So
then why would you develop the Typhoon if the UK had the TSR2,
the Tornado? Because the Tornado was the Tornado Tornado was a true multi-role aircraft. I'm going to say multi-role again. I'm talking about the airframe. I'm not talking about you jump in the plane, you can do everything. You can do something
But you're
different.
talking about something that was 10 years later.
Yeah.
Don't forget, we're not saying there wouldn't be any development of a TSR2 in the 60s, even if it went into production in the later 60s.
But it wasn't agile enough. So the Tornado was a true multi-role aircraft. And as I said, I keep emphasizing, I don't mean the same airframe to everything. The literal same. I mean the same airframe had the potential. So it was a tactical aircraft. It was an interdictor. So its role in Europe and its role in Desert Storm in the early 90s and the subsequent later Iraqi war was to interdict airfields, interdict troop concentrations well behind the enemy lines. Now that's what TSR2 was designed to do, but it was also capable of it carried a Mauser cannon, it carried cluster bombs. It was also designed to attack armored formations that were in contact with friendly forces. So it was both a tactical and a strategic aircraft. The TSR2 was never designed to be attacking Russian tank formations as they were in contact with NATO tank formations, whereas the Tornado was. So it was a more rounded aircraft. So it had a greater export potential. All right, the Saudi deal was a little bit odd. It was the biggest ever export, military export, probably any export thing they ever signed by a British company. A bit of corruption in there, a lot of corruption in there, but that's that's the way of the world. Some countries, it's not inconceivable that some countries like Saudi and because Saudi did buy Lightnings in which was a British interceptor fighter with a great performance but very short range. But they might have bought it as a vanity thing, never intending to use it. How much kit would be stripped out on the insistence of the Israeli-American lobby? I don't know, but you could argue to say why didn't he do that? But later on with the Tornado, so. The TSR2, yes, I'm not suggesting that the Australians may have bought into it. The Saudis may have bought a small number, but you would never persuade the Italians or the Germans to buy it because they didn't see that deep strike and the tactical nuclear stuff, that wasn't their game. So and then who else would be in that boat? But I think it would have undoubtedly could have or would have been undoubtedly a successful aircraft in the RAF. I don't, but.
I mean, there could have been a spin-off. I'm thinking, I know the Tornado is a spin-off, but I'm just thinking
it's
Tornado would be...
It's more as a successor as much as it...
No, that's right. But I mean, if you'd have had a successful TSR2, whatever it ended up being called, you could have had a successful evolution of a different version of a TSR2, which was smaller or...
Yeah, I mean, one thing...
Whatever,
One thing we're not going to do because I don't have the figures to hand, but the way of looking at a successful aircraft is, has it defended the country, or did the country need defending? But it's all about cost. For example, the existing, how over its lifetime, how many engineers do I need to maintain 100 aircraft over 15 years? How many new engines do I need for 100 aircraft over 15 years, etc., etc., etc.? Now, the figures they were doing for the TSR2 were coming out fairly disastrously. The cost, its unit cost over its lifetime. Nothing, this is where, you look at the F-35, which is a modern aircraft that many countries are buying. Unbelievable unit cost. You buy it up front, and its cost over lifetime. In most cases, most countries can't even know why they've bought them and will never be able to fly them in 5 years' time, notwithstanding some kill switch that the Americans might have inserted. But so the cost of the aircraft is not you just turn up; it's the maintenance cost and it's the number of people you need to train and how many hours it sits in the hangar versus flying. The TSR2 wasn't coming out great on that equation, although that's all speculation because nobody knows because it never actually went into service and there was never enough built.
That's right, yeah.
But
I mean, I didn't realise one of the things that did come out of TSR2 was the engines for Concorde. Was the Olympus engines.
But then they were
TSR2.
Yeah, but that was a bit chicken and egg, really. I mean, that was a bit. The engines were, the engines were being developed, and yes, they were using TSR2. Would they've been developed without TSR2? Yes, because those engines went into the British Phantoms. So so the British Phantoms are different engines from everybody else's engines.
Didn't know that.
It's slightly, you'd have to see the British Phantoms look a little bit different round the back because the engines are a little bit wider, etc., etc. So, and
were they supersonic, the British Phantoms?
Yeah. And they did smoke either. But if you ever seen an American Phantom come over the horizon, you can see it from miles because of the smoky G79.
But it was the thing that, the TSR2 footage I've seen, they're always smoking engines. It's funny, there's a Lightning next to it and that's got no...
Well, okay, but
but the TSR2 always has smoke coming out.
But a British Phantom, wouldn't, but the American built Phantoms were faster than British Phantoms, but you were talking like, 50 miles an hour top. It's interesting if you look at modern aircraft, just raw speed. It's never has been a thing, because raw speed, a Phantom could go, a Lightning could go really fast for about 10 minutes and it was out of fuel. I mean, really fast. So it's always a balance. You can go as fast as you like for about 10 minutes. And what do I do now? An aircraft that isn't in the sky because it's had to go home, or you have an aircraft that's in the sky. It's a trade-off. But anyway, going back to TSR2, the alternative, I think it would have been much like some other British aircraft. It would have been probably a successful aircraft. It would have had a series of upgrades. It would have had a lifetime of 15 to 20 years. I doubt anybody else.
Which is a long time for aircraft in the RAF.
Well, it's the Canberra only went out of service 10 years ago, so it'd been in service for 50 years. But it not, the last version of it was half a dozen left. And all this. You're right. I mean, it's certainly aircraft that were flying in the 50s didn't last very long because the technology was changing. But the Phantom's still being flown. The Phantom's still being flown by the Germans and the Turks, off the top of my head. So
font of all knowledge on these. Where?
Well,
I know you're
interested. No, I know the Greeks are still flying Phantoms, 100%. But I don't know when the ones they're flying might have only been built in 1980 something. But they weren't built in 1960 something. I'm talking about the design rather than the physical aircraft, if you know what I mean, in terms of its length. And obviously the B-52, they reckon will fly till it's 100. Purpose is another story altogether. But I mean, but anyway, but we'll have Russian stars in it by then. But the TSR2 would have been a niche. To a certain extent, a bit like the Buccaneer. Again, for those you're not familiar with, the British naval aircraft that was used by the RAF as a low-level strike aircraft, kind of replaced the TSR2, as you said, John, amongst other things. If nobody else bought that, it's a well-liked, loved aircraft, if you see what I mean. TSR2, it was a damn thing. Nicer looking aircraft. The TSR2, nobody would say would win a beauty contest. Not the most attractive looking aircraft ever built.
No, but there's some, I always, when you look at it and you look at those short, stubby wings, which
it looks fast, even when it's on the ground, sort of thing. It's that, it's of its time. It's sort of.
I don't know what. I mean, so one of the things that it had, which I don't know whether that was unique. Well, I'm pretty certain it's not unique. Was they had fully blown ailerons. So when it was flying at slow speeds, it was still manoeuvrable and safe.
Yeah.
As the exhaust gases are coming out of the wing.
Yeah.
And blowing over the ailerons, which I haven't seen on any other plane. I'm assuming
that was cutting edge, no pun intended. That was for the period. I mean, there was a lot of and there was something called boundary layer control, which I know of, but I really am not going to. It's a bit like trying to explain some of these Stephen Hawking's concepts. You read it and you think, oh, that's very clever, and try to explain it to somebody else. So it had boundary layer control, which is something it would do with shock waves and how it went supersonic and all the rest of it. And that was, again, it wasn't unique, but there was only so many countries could develop aircraft of this complexity. So I think, I've got no idea whether I was, as I say, was it the right decision to cancel it? Well, what does it matter what I think? But I think the answer is probably yes, on the basis that we're all still here under a democracy. And as I say, you could argue, well, maybe somebody died as a result of not having a proper aircraft. Well, I could think where you could make the argument of Britain getting rid of its aircraft carriers, or its fast jet aircraft carriers, resulted in people being killed in the Falklands War. But I can't think of an equivalent, for the TSR2. There was no action that required an aircraft of its capability in the late 1960s, early 1970s that I can think of that was missing, that the TSR2 would have uniquely filled and resulted in some sort of, deterrent or victory or whatever. So was the decision right? Who knows? The biggest thing, I suppose, as you say, is the impact to the British aircraft industry. Is the the Phantom had British bits in it, British engines, but they were all still built. They were manufactured in America. The Buccaneer, yes, was built in Britain, but nobody bought. Well, they tell a lie. The South Africans bought about a dozen. But how much that impact that made to the British economy, I couldn't say. But 12, it's not a huge I mean, the technology.
It still has a big aircraft, military aircraft. I think it does, doesn't it?
Well, it does, but the argument was that in the 60s and 70s, the market was huge for aircraft because they were relatively cheap. So medium and small
hundreds of millions.
Yeah, medium and small sized countries were buying 150 aircraft. Like New Zealand or 40 aircraft. It has none now, fighter aircraft. Then there's other countries that struggled. They have an air force on paper and they have nothing. They're all sitting in the hangar. That wasn't the case in the 60s and 70s, or certainly the 60s. And it's not so much that they would have bought the TSR2. They wouldn't, but they would have bought something else that the companies that were reduced to certainly bolting bits on American aircraft to a large extent. And, they could have built something else that they would have bought. If TSR2 had gone through and been successful, and then they got more money and they wouldn't have gone bust, and they wouldn't have amalgamated into one or two companies, but eventually became one. So there's a whole sort of economic argument there. But the people arguing about things like this on Twitter, and believe it or not, there are such people, they're not really caring about the economics. They're all about, what a nice looking plane, how dare that?
That's right.
And you factor in the fact that it was a Labour government. Outrageous, typical Labour government, blah, blah, blah. The fact
that they forget what the 60s was like.
Yeah. Well, they also forget that the Conservatives always chalk back the military more than Labour ever do anyway. And that's a statistical fact. You want to go look at David Cameron, for example, who chalked the Harrier Force completely to nothing, got rid of the aircraft carriers 5 years earlier, blah, 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 and there's nothing to replace them. But sometimes they seem to get away with it for some reason. I don't know why. But, so it's an interesting story. It's more of a, what would have happened had that been bought at great expense, been a successful aircraft, probably very expensive, but, c'est la vie, could have kept the British aircraft industry going. Maybe they wouldn't have had to,
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah. I mean, who knows where the British aircraft industry would be had it survived. Might have
So as John, I need to go very shortly, but as John has said, there's lots of videos and speculation and good.
I'm hoping we've got some people who are on Blue Sky arguing about whether it was a good plane or not, listening, because then we might get some comments, because let's face it.
Well, the question is not necessarily was it a good plane, was it a plane that Britain could afford?
So if you've got any feedback, please let us know. Hopefully you enjoyed today's episode. We will be returning very soon with another episode. So thanks for all that feedback, Ian. I know that you enjoyed that.
Indeed.
Hopefully you did. It sounded like it.
It did.
So thanks for listening, everybody. You'll hear from us again soon. Bye for now.
Bye.
And that's it. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. But after listening to us natter on, why not let us know what you think? Find us on Blue Sky by searching for Chats in Time. On Facebook, search ORC Time. And on X, we are ORC_time. Until next time, cheerio!